Hey, deserving listeners, this is our final chapter on our deep dive on the psychology of the Menendez brothers and the whole case and all the various different twists and turns and the debates. So this is our final chapter.
I think it's 7.
And let's get to it. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk and Humberto. I'm a therapist, and I'm also a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I exterminate robotic termites.
So take it away, Burrow.
So last time you asked me a question that I couldn't answer, but I since spent countless hours researching the topic, and I'm now the world's foremost expert. The question of whatever happened to Dr. Oziel? After the case, Dr. Oziel was stripped of his license.
Really?
He lost his license.
That's encouraging. I would not have thought that.
I know, right?
Because even though that's the right thing that should happen, I think,
Yeah.
that often doesn't happen, strangely. So, okay. Do we know who made, I could imagine that it was the client/girlfriend who made the complaint, but...
Well, are you sitting down? Because the California Board of Psychology determined that wrongfully, Dr. Oziel shared information about the Menendez brothers with Smith, who was the girlfriend/client, right? And since it was a client, they also accused him of sexual misconduct. So basically, what you would want to have happen, happened.
Yeah.
It's the 2 counts were, hey, you shared information with this client of yours, and then also you were sexually misconducting with this client. So yeah. In 2017, he did an interview with some magazine or something. He said, I did not surrender my license due to the accusation, which implies I gave up my practice because of things I did allege to the original accusation. Instead, I had phased out of my practice because I had a major business offer that was highly lucrative and moved on to be the CEO of a large business, blah, 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 blah. No agency ever found I did a thing that was improper or wrong. So how does that combine with the California Board of Psychology?
Well, what was the quote from the...
That the California Board of Psychology determined that Dr. Oziel wrongfully shared information about the Menendez brothers.
And concluded to do what?
Well, I don't know. That's what they found, that he wrongfully shared information.
So you don't know what they decided because of that?
Yeah, it doesn't say.
Okay. Well, if we believe him, then he saw the writing on the wall that his license would be stripped or that it would be seriously sanctioned or his reputation was completely shot.
You mean if we don't believe him?
No, if we believe him.
Well, if we believe him, this had nothing to do with the accusation.
Oh. Well, no, if we believe him that his license wasn't taken away.
Oh, right, sure.
That he let it lapse because you have to renew it every year. And so to avoid the humiliation, he just didn't renew the license, and then the licensing board didn't have a license to take away. But typically licensing boards, hopefully, but often they don't, is they will say, even though the individual no longer has a license, we bar this person from ever getting a license in this state because of the findings. So
yeah, the way I read it was, you're probably right. The way I read it was along those lines, which was the Board of Psychology was like, yeah, you did this, you're going to lose your license, surrender it. And then he was like, okay, I surrender my license. And later was like, oh, no, that had nothing to do with it. I was a CEO. Is it,
Yeah. I mean, even just the way that he's worded. Tell me the quote again.
Yeah. I did not surrender my license due to the accusation, which implies I gave up my practice because I did things alleged in the original accusation. Instead, I'm adding the instead. I had phased out of my practice because I had a major business offer that was highly lucrative and moved to be the CEO of a large business in another state a year and a half prior to the surrender.
What a fucking dirtbag.
What?
What a fucking dirtbag. He probably exploited another therapist or another client out of their money like he was going to do to the Menendez brothers.
Honda, it says no agency ever found I did a thing that was improper or wrong.
Well, I don't need an agency to tell me that because it's on record that you had sex with one of your clients. You called one of your girlfriend clients to listen behind a door that should be soundproofed, and then you had your girlfriend client move into your house. And then she came clean. And the only reason why we hear about the Menendez brothers is because you fucked up as a therapist so royally.
Yeah.
So I don't need a licensing board to tell me that you're a fucking dirtbag.
Dr. Oziel reportedly changed his name to Jerry and moved to New Mexico, where he works at the Marital Meditation Center, a facility that seeks to improve marriages through guided meditations.
Oh, of course. So he just took a lateral move into pseudoscience or into alternative medicine or whatever, and is still doing clinical work, but I don't know what, I can't say, but he is doing work that is allowable under the law, but is like clinical-ish, you know what I mean?
Why are you so skeptical?
Which happens all the time. It happens all the time.
He became a high-powered CEO, and now he's guiding meditations.
Yeah, and fine, maybe he's helpful, maybe he's being helpful for you. But this happens all the time when you have clinicians in my field who are caught. I just did a whole deep dive on Maurice Harker, a very similar thing. He allowed his license to lapse. The surrendering of the license word is a little funny.
Yeah.
Typically, we say that it was just allowed to lapse or not renewed or something. And then they just sidestep the entire process and just claim they're a coach or they're a healer or something. Yeah. And they're allowed to just continue doing what they're doing. And I'm just going to take a guess and say that whatever personality rotten core is in the guy did not resolve itself, and is even kind of in his language of just like, no, I didn't do anything wrong. It's alleged, and I'm a high-powered CEO. It's like, that's not a case. That just furthers the dirtbag case. Like, that's your argument? I'm a high-powered CEO. You can't say that about me. Like, what a fucking dirtbag.
But what if he asks you to invest in his high-powered CEO company, and if you don't, he'll take you to court? Like, then it's cool.
Take me to court for what?
Because you're accusing him of not, I don't know. All right. So that was what happened. It is
scientifically proven the guy's a dirtbag.
All right. So that was what happened to our dear, esteemed Dr. Oziel. All right. So when we last left off, the brothers went off to jail. They had already been in jail for 8 years, but they were now officially off to spend life in jail without the possibility of parole. Yeah, they tried appeals based on both errors that were committed and also on arguments about like, hey, they didn't, it was unfair that they didn't let us introduce sexual abuse allegations in the second trial, et cetera. None of it worked. Courts repeatedly declined. So they were, that's what it was. And that was essentially the end of the story until the pandemic. Let me ask you, what is one trend that you remember started and took off during the pandemic?
Making bread.
Yes, that's true. Okay. Let's go through trends. A few trends.
Zoom calls
for sure.
Staying home, masks.
Yeah.
Washing your hands.
Yes.
Using UV light to disinfect your phone.
That's right. Now think of
working from home.
Right. And now think of things that would have had social networking kind of trends.
People running out of toilet paper. And having to share toilet paper among friends.
Yeah.
What would you say? What do you say? Social?
Things related to social networks.
Increasing podcasting and YouTube
Definitely.
stuff.
Oh yeah, everyone bought their own mics, their own thing. Everyone became a podcaster.
Social distancing.
We started the podcast in 2020, right?
Yeah. What was the question?
Basically, what happened during the pandemic that would have been trends. One of the trends was TikTok. The rise of TikTok.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And what started happening is there had been a 2017 NBC miniseries that I had mentioned in one of the previous episodes. There was a Law and Order true crime miniseries for the Menendez, right? And it went into a lot of the details that actually were the sexual abuse allegation, all that stuff. But, 2017, who was paying attention to TV in 2017? And it sort of went under the radar. But because of the TikTok generation and the rise of TikTok, people started making TikToks discussing the Menendez brothers case.
Well, and who knows what the factors are. We'll never know because these things aren't really measurable. But one of the trends that I have seen is that with Me Too in 2016, 2017, the first wave of application was for women. Mm-hmm. Then there was a smaller second wave of, there's also men that have been abused and also deserve some acknowledgement. And the original Me Too movement wasn't just about women, but it was women that were coming forward. And some people, I think, falsely claimed that it was only about women victims, which I found to be silly. It's like it should just be about all of it. It's not like men are able to come forward when they're victimized. It's the opposite, actually. I mean, everyone is shamed and everyone is oppressed and everyone's harmed, but men are particularly, if there's a spectrum there. But there was a kind of secondary wave, with Cruz. What's his name? Terry Crews. Yeah. So I could see how people would say, okay, let's start expanding our search here. Let's expand this movement. What other cases have we not been looking at more closely? The Menendez brothers.
But how did you and I miss this TikTok trend?
Because we don't look at TikTok.
So yeah, apparently there was this big thing on TikTok about the Menendez brothers, starting in 2020, 2021, where young people would find this mini series and then started digging through all the trial information, and all the court TV videos were still there and stuff. So they started posting and started showing a different light, basically positioning them as not spoiled rich kids, but more like abuse survivors. So this was a trend. Now, that by itself doesn't do anything, but it was the start of something. It's very interesting. So that was 2020, 2021. And you and I, as unaware as you and I were, apparently a lot of young people became aware. Then in 2023, so still pandemic time, but towards the tail end, right? Like May of 2023. So here's what's crazy, man. First of all, Roy Rosello, which was the former member of the band Menudo, came forward in the documentary. But before I mention this bit, something to understand about Menudo is like this dark history of Menudo. The original idea was, hey, Menudo is going to be this evergreen band where we are always swapping out as the boys get older. We swap them out with new boys. Sounds pretty cool. Well, that is unfortunately and it's music industry, and it's like, boys will have to travel all over the place. So think of what better arena for a predator to happen. Well, this other, not Jose Menendez, but this other executive, the guy who initially grabbed them and then took him to RCA and stuff. That guy was accused of like 6 different Menudo members accused this other guy of abuse. But Roy Rosello, which is one of the former members, also accused Jose Menendez. And it wasn't just like, Jose Menendez touched me on a flight, which is bad enough. See if this sounds familiar to you. He was invited to go to an executive suite while he was in New York.
Trigger warning?
Trigger warning. Definitely trigger warning.
You're going to give some details.
Some details, yeah.
Okay.
Trigger warning. He was invited to go to a suite of an executive for RCA in New York. And he was told, hey.
And he's, 15 at the time?
Yeah, I don't have the age written here, but he's likely, because that's the ages. I think the younger ones were like 13. Yeah. The older ones, like as soon as they were like 18, you're like, dude, come on. Definitely underage. And he's in New York, and he's invited to go to the suite of this RCA executive, and, told like, hey, if you play your cards right. He's told by the other guy who's the other abuser. He's told if you play your cards right, your career can go places. But, you're a boy. You don't know what the hell that means. Anyways, goes to the suite. He argues that Jose Menendez offered him wine, and he told him this is a very fancy wine, to drink it. He drank the wine, and then he says that everything went hazy, and he lost consciousness.
Wow. Similar to P. Diddy, similar to Bill Cosby.
He says that when he woke up, it was obvious to him, you fill in how, that he had been brutally raped. And this is when he was a teenager, mid-1980s. So this comes up. This is, again, May 2023. This documentary comes out, and there's this allegation. And people are like, wait, Jose Menendez, that sounds familiar.
So the landscape, because of advocates in my field, because of advocates in victims awareness arenas, because of brave journalists that focused, and also because of the brave victims that came forward publicly, including a number of famous actresses, then we were pushed forward in terms of general awareness of all the aspects, not only of the prevalence, the high prevalence of sexual abuse and harassment, not only in music industry or entertainment industry, but also just in all contexts, work, home, this sort of thing. But also it was more widely talked about, more widely educated, more widely understood of how this can affect someone and how it can result in some apparently unintuitive kind of results, like you might not ever tell anyone, So you could have someone like Eric and Lyle who are being repeatedly raped at home, and never tell anyone. Whereas apparently for some people without knowing, they'll say, well, if you never told anyone and you're suddenly now just saying it, you must be just making it up. Obviously, the seas have changed to some extent anyway.
Yeah, somewhat.
So when this individual comes forward, and also on the heels of Harvey Weinstein and all the others that had dozens of people, Bill Cosby, others, just dozens of people coming forward, there's a greater chance for society generally to hear this allegation and say, there's probably a good chance that this person's telling the truth because there's so many consequences to come forward. The default mode that victims will fall into is to not report because of all the stigma and the consequence and the shaming and the hatred and the professional consequences. So for someone to come forward, then it's like, this is probably this is the tip of the iceberg often. It's not always. And sometimes people are lying, but a lot more readily believing. And then they're like, well, wait, this is the guy. And so now, so let's now revisit that whole narrative.
But now, wait a minute. But couldn't you say, well, this guy, Roy Rosello, maybe he just wants to extort Jose Menendez for money in 2023?
Yeah, but he's dead.
For decades. So what reason would he have to throw this random dead dude? Like, does he owe a favor to the Menendez brothers? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, so, of course, this third-party validation all of a sudden is very interesting because, and then I have a question for you. Remember the thing you did when we were talking about P. Diddy, about thinking of the difference between what's known publicly versus what might actually be the true numbers behind the scenes? Mm-hmm. Remember, this guy, Jose, was a high-powered executive at many companies, including eventually 2 different media companies. RCA is global. This other one, I don't know the reach, but it was a huge company. And he was in power for many years during these time frames.
And I don't know, but I could imagine the ability for a predator to get away with it even more so south of the border, where there's fewer laws, or I don't know, or more desperation from families to come out of poverty or something, that predators would even be, or at the very least, they would think they would get away with it more. So I could see how people of color would be much more, because this is demonstrated by data as well, that people of color are, any oppressed class is, generally speaking, more victimized by all sorts of oppression and harm and victim and abuse, including sexual abuse, that sort of thing. So I could see how Jose Menendez he's at RCA Records, and I could see how other execs could say, well, you're Hispanic, why don't you handle the Hispanic cases? And then he's thinking, ooh, I can get away with.
And I'm actually even thinking, because this is the 80s, and if we now believe the actual accounts, this guy is a vicious, sadistic psychopath, right?
Yeah.
And he's a millionaire, high-powered. I'm thinking there could easily be a string of people that were abused.
Right. So for people who don't know, you're talking about how in the P. Diddy episode, I did a whole segment on estimating the true number of victims for a few dozen different major perpetrators, whether it's Kevin Spacey or Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby or P. Diddy or this. And what I ended up finding, and it's just rough estimates, and I had different factors like the ability for the perpetrator to keep people silent, the threat that the perpetrator would present, like a Kevin Spacey would present a certain level of threat, but someone like P. Diddy, there would be much greater threat, not only because of just the sheer amount of money he has, but the amount of influence he has and the kind of...
The bodyguards with machine guns.
Right, and the kind of vibe that he carries with him. People wouldn't think that Kevin Spacey was capable of murder necessarily, right? But the implication is there with P. Diddy. So there are certain factors that would, in my mind, raise the estimate. It's just speculative. But if we have with P. Diddy, you have a few hundred people that have come forward. I think there's some numbers in like close to 1,000 or something. But in terms of the legal case, and then you say, well, on average, it's something like 5% of people come forward. Depends on the context. And so you expand it out, and P. Diddy was him and Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell are in the thousands of victims over the span of a number of decades. So to your point, with someone like Jose Menendez, who we're hearing from 3 victims, his own sons, and you're hearing from this other person, and you also add the factor of if a lot of the victims are boys and men, they're even less likely to come forward. They're even less likely to recognize that they were a victim of rape, right?
Now, let alone in the 80s.
Right. And then you add the factors of he has, with this Menudo member, who knows, but you could imagine that even if he did acknowledge, I was just raped by this exec at RCA, but my entire livelihood and the chance for my family to be pulled out of poverty or whatever is dependent on me playing ball. I can't tell anyone about that. Whereas if it was just like a random person that he met at a party or something, there wouldn't be that. People generally still don't report that, but you start adding in the factors in and you see, oh my God, there could be dozens, hundreds of, and I think a major factor, I don't know if I included this in my speculative analysis, but the level of psychopathy and sadism, I think, is another factor, obviously. And the obsessiveness, like with P. Diddy, he seemed to be obsessed with, if we believe the allegations, with sexual sadism.
Yeah.
He was known for engaging in all sorts of things. But with Jose Menendez, if we believe the accounts of the sons, this individual is high-level, obsessive sexual sadist, someone who wakes up in the morning and says, I must today at some point sexually rape someone. I want someone to be upset as I am raping. That's definite. You don't want to, it's not just about sex. It's about having sex with, it's getting sexual gratification from someone who doesn't want to have sex with you and or is being harmed. And the victim exhibits that harm. They're not trying to find a way to coerce the child to like it. They want the individual not to like it. We have evidence that, based on the account of the neighbor or the friend or whatever, that there was not necessarily even attraction to children, but to anyone. And children are just easier to victimize, which is a profile of a sexual sadist and a rapist, that some people that are having sex with children, they're not attracted to children particularly. They're just attracted to the harm sexually of any human being, and sometimes animals. So that's basically what you're getting at.
Yeah.
But let's take a break. When we get back, check in with yourself emotionally. This is heavy. But when we get back, we'll continue with this twist. Yeah. All right, back from the break. Take it away, Bertle.
Okay, so the revelation, like I said, was important because it was a third-party confirmation. Well, then something else happens. You think like, okay, well, that's enough. But no, more stuff happens. Okay, do you remember that I mentioned this other cousin that had Andy, that had testified in the first trial, that Eric had contemporaneously shared with him that he was being abused by his father, and that the prosecution had an airtight counter, which was, you're lying, sir, right? Well, Andy, unfortunately, ended up completing suicide. And when he died, his mother found, you sort of almost predicted this one in one of your splatter of thoughts. His mother found a letter that Eric had wrote to Andy at the time. A contemporaneous letter that Eric wrote to his cousin Andy at the time when the abuse was happening. So not after the murders, not leading up to, way before that, when the abuse was happening. And this letter was, it said things like, it's still happening, Andy, but it's worse for me now. I never know when it's going to happen, and it's driving me crazy. He said that his father had warned him 100 times about telling anyone what the consequences would be. He mentioned that his father was becoming overweight and that he hated and like a lot of details in this letter to his cousin. Because, the only evidence you had was the cousin testified, but there was an actual letter that Eric had written, right? So now you have this external third-party thing, then you have this letter. And of course, if you can imagine, as the boys are now, these are men, are finding out about this while they're in jail, they're contacting their lawyers, or maybe their lawyers are contacting them and things like that. Eric was asked what he thought of the revelation from Roy Rossello, the ex-Menudo member. Eric said that it was very sad to know that there was another victim, but he always hoped that the truth about his dad would come out. So that was his statement.
To me, I'm like, well, yeah. If you watch the testimony of Eric and Lyle in the trial, it's not hard to imagine that they're telling the truth. At least there's a good possibility. We can never know, right? But if we assume that at least part of what they're telling is truthful, then of course the sadistic abuser, sadistic rapist raped other people besides his two sons. Horrible, but what did you expect? So what I'm hearing is that the landscape was that Menendez brothers were lying the whole time. They're murderers, they're greedy, they're spoiled, and they made up the whole thing, or there's a possibility they made up the whole thing. And then you get this corroborating evidence of the letter and this other victim coming forward, and maybe a sea change of understanding. Yep. Maybe a younger generation on TikTok that isn't infected or brainwashed the way that our generations were about these kind of topics. And they're like, wait a second, maybe the Menendez brothers were actual victims. Well, yeah.
Yeah, right.
But it doesn't necessarily change the legal situation, though.
Sort of. It turns out that when there's new evidence, sometimes you can do a habeas corpus petition, which means, hey, there's new evidence. And, that could easily be dismissed too if the evidence is irrelevant or whatever. But in this case, armed with those two pieces of information, third party saying, hey, Jose drugged and raped me, and the cousin that testified, actually, there was a letter at the time.
So I don't know if you know the legal results, but if the appeals on the second trial were not successful all the way
in
to
1996.
Okay.
Or sorry, in the late 90s.
Then this still wouldn't matter, because the question was not whether or not they were abused. The question was, were they in grave danger of being killed in that particular moment by the parents that would justify self-defense of killing the person?
Yeah. So the lawyers argued, hey, listen, first of all, as we've stated before, but that was denied, the second trial didn't even include any of the information about the sexual abuse, which we believe is what could have influenced a jury to explain why they feared for their lives and therefore give them the benefit of the doubt for manslaughter, right? And we didn't have these two key pieces of information, which legally do have a lot of validity because, again, it is not just hearsay or just from the two murderers saying I was abused, but actually total, especially the third party from the Menudo case, right? So they said, hey, we need a retrial, or we need a new hearing, or a retrial, because this evidence could have influenced a jury had they heard it. Okay. So they asked the court to vacate the convictions or do a new hearing based on this. Okay. So around this time, the district attorney, George Gascon, publicly acknowledged the new evidence, and they said they would review the case. So that was where we were at. In either case, this was...
So that's where we're at right now?
No.
Oh.
No. There's more.
No.
But wait, there is more. But this was where we were in May of 2023. But it's amazing that after...
And this is when we started getting a lot of emails from
is it?
People saying, you gotta talk about the Menendez brothers.
It's funny because you had mentioned that. You had mentioned, hey, we're getting requests. And I also had no idea why. Because I also didn't know any of this stuff.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard this resurgence. Literally until I started doing the research, I hadn't actually heard anything about the resurgence. But anyways, that was happening in May of... So people in the know and paying attention, especially all those kids who in 2020 and 2021 were doing their TikToks, were like, see, we told you, look, right? And this does lead to, late in 2023, a groundswell of support. So basically the public starts all paying, well, except for us, a lot of the public. So a whole bunch of new true crime podcasts and TV specials start covering. We're asleep at the wheel at the time. It's okay. And they start like then going over all the evidence and, oh, but wait, I didn't know they said this and all that other stuff. And so more debates happening. And remember I said how they were like 30 plus witnesses that the defense wanted to call and they were not allowed. Well, a lot of them were family members. And including like Kitty's sister, their aunt and stuff like that. They start speaking out.
Well, so the question I had was, did they have firsthand data about either the physical or sexual abuse?
Yeah.
Because if they had seen hints or had heard things, then that's one layer of evidence. But if they actually I saw the father rape the kid, or I saw them coming out of the room, or I saw him beat the kids, or I saw him threaten the kids or something.
We may never know, other than interviews, we may never know what they could have testified to. But what is clear is that they were all the relatives that came out were consistent in a couple of points. One of them is that Kitty herself was an abuse victim, that Jose was brutal to Kitty. Number two, that they had witnessed countless cases of Jose being vicious to the boys. Not sexual abuse, but vicious.
Yeah. Physically? I mean...
Yeah, both. Okay. Verbally and physically.
Right. So this is the first time that I'm hearing about...
And that anyone
about any account of the father being abusive to the mother.
Yeah.
But a long time ago, I'm pretty sure I said something like, it would be really weird if they had a good relationship.
Yeah.
If he wasn't abusive to the wife. It's possible, but it'd be very strange. So we're getting...
remember I mentioned that he had multiple affairs. She had, according to the brothers, she had been led to drinking. They claimed that she was suicidal. All these things, right? It paints maybe a different picture of why she was, quote, complicit in all this. Okay. But in either case, the family members that would have been, in fact, Kitty's sister, who normally, even though she is their aunt, and may have some sympathy because she knew them as little boys and all these things, but she's also her sister, right?
Meaning that in other situations, Kitty's sister would be hateful of the boys for killing her sister.
Yeah, or at least more conflicted.
So if she's coming to the defense, essentially, of the boys, then that really drives, it adds to credibility.
At least you would have imagined her being very conflicted. No, when the family members, they were interviewed, they would speak out and they would say they absolutely support the boys and they wish that they could have a reduced sentence or a retrial, whatever. And that even to the point, and we'll see a clip of this. In fact, I sent you the link. So maybe we should watch this clip and you'll see what I'm talking about.
But was Kitty Menendez actually capable of killing her own children? Her sister believes Kitty's husband, Jose, always came first.
She wouldn't have stopped him.
Is there forgiveness?
Not yet.
No, I can't. For what she did to those, allowed to happen to those kids.
Do you forgive Lyle and Eric Menendez for what they did?
Yes, absolutely.
So it looks like what we're seeing there is Kitty's sister
and other relatives. I forget who the other two are, but they're also related to Kitty.
Okay, and they are very quick to say, yes, I forgive the boys, but I don't forgive Kitty. Yeah, which is a little questionable because there's a chance that Kitty was even more abused than the boys, which is hard to imagine.
Yeah.
We can't know that. Yeah. But there's at the very least, can you imagine what it would be like to be married to someone like him? The amount of control, the amount of berating, the Machiavellian nature of like, I am going to head you off the path before you, report this to anybody.
You heard her say that she does not imagine Kitty would have stopped Jose.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So to blame Kitty, it's hard to know. And are there spouses, even wives, who are part of the abuse perpetration? Absolutely. That happens. It's not always the case that the wife, although complicit, is doing that because of their victim status. Sometimes they're abusive as well. Or it's hard to, tease this out though over time because the amount of gaslighting, actual gaslighting, not TikTok version gaslighting, but actual brainwashing and gaslighting that can happen in a relationship like that. It's hard to know what's volitional and what's not.
Right.
But anyway, that's interesting, and it helps the credibility. But again, for me, in my layperson's point of view, I don't know if it changes anything legally, but I guess we'll find out.
Well,
it certainly changes public opinion,
right.
which,
That's a great point. So far, remember, yes, the defense has filed, hey, we need to do this. And yes, the groundswell of opinion, but we haven't seen if it has any effect yet, right? And also, to your point, public opinion means very little when it comes to the law as it's written, right? That said, if someone was trying to paint a picture of ongoing threat and dread from an absolute sadistic psychopath, they certainly were gaining a lot more evidence, right, than just the two boys claiming. Okay. And there is something also powerful, like if I were in a jury and I hear family members of the deceased speaking like this, I'm like, oh, maybe I have this wrong. Right? Another interesting thing was that Kitty, remember that Eric testified that Kitty also didn't treat him well. Like he would lock him in a closet. He would have to beg for a thing pail so he could go to the bathroom. No one else had visuals on that. Like no one had an account of that. But because the brothers shot her too, right? So that makes it also nuanced. Like as a jury member, I might be like, well, I understand why you shot your dad, but your mom, and so like there's all that complexity. So to your point, this isn't just, it's still not like, oh, well, shoot, we got it wrong, release them, right? But it's adding. Also, some celebrities join in the fray, of course. Kim Kardashian in 2024 wrote an op-ed, which she's a prominent legal and psychologist.
Yeah, this reminds me of, what's his face, the comedian. We got to find out what Ja Rule has to say.
Yes.
What's his name? Dave Chappelle. He has
it's in that special, right?
Yeah. He's just like, why do people, want to know what celebrities, what's happening in the Middle East? I gotta find out what Ja Rule has to say about someone contact Ja Rule. It's like someone contact Kim Kardashian. Yeah. Like anyway, but it's evidence as to how much. And certainly, Kim Kardashian can chime in. I mean, you and I are chiming in, so anyone can chime in. But but it's evidence that this groundswell of support 30 years later was happening.
And I will say that
you and I were we
were out of it. Yeah. I will say the sentiment of this op-ed that Kim Kardashian wrote, I agree. Like, I'm glad she did. It was about how pervasive stigma about male sexual abuse likely deprived the brothers of a fair trial back in the day. And it's her opinion. But I think it's a good thing to opine on, right? It's like, hey, I wonder if there was a bad stigma about male sexual. Yeah, definitely.
And I think particularly the question that I think you were mulling over in the previous chapter about if the jury is given the option of downgrading from first-degree murder to a lesser charge, then absolutely I could see how changing times and the prevention of data, either because they didn't have it yet or it was just purposely prevented from entering the court because you have a judge and a legal system that is in denial about sexual abuse, particularly for boys, then that absolutely, I think, is a legal case that you have legs to stand on there.
Yeah. And then lastly here, and then we will go to Patron Zone. The last thing that was interesting that I wrote down in my notes is PTSD, and you would know a lot more about how this stood back in the day, but the note I had was that society didn't really have much of an understanding, probably still doesn't, about PTSD when the trials initially happened. But one of the expert witnesses from the defense, I believe, had stated that in their professional opinion, Eric was probably suffering from PTSD, but that likely wouldn't have meant anything to an average juror. Today, let alone back then. So that was another interesting thing. I'm wondering from your perspective, have you seen a change in the understanding of PTSD over the last 30 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I entered the field around this time in 95. The fourth edition of the DSM came out in 94, and that is just one publication that represents sort of a consensus in a particular area, PTSD included. And each edition of the DSM has expanded the criterion regarding what can be included in the traumas that can result in PTSD. In the original definition, I'm trying to remember my history, going back to post-World War II, that it was only people that had witnessed death and destruction, soldiers in war. Then there was acknowledgement that, hey, there's other people who have PTSD, but they didn't have that circumstance. So we need to start to include other kinds of experiences, like being sexually abused. There's not an explicit threat to your life or to anyone's life, but we clearly see a connection there. Research also, and they keep expanding that first criterion to include. Okay, well, let's include that. Okay, let's include. To me, I have always thought that the criterion should just say the individual experienced terror. Because there are certain experiences that do result in PTSD, and I've seen it clinically, and research actually shows us, but it doesn't meet the criteria for PTSD because the specificness of the trauma. Like, for example, I had a client once that her husband had left the house. He left his phone behind. The phone was blown up with texts. She's like, geez, who's texting my husband constantly? She looks at the phone and discovers that he's been cheating and is reading the exchange,
Oh, boy.
It's very shocking to the system. It's like it came out of the blue. She had no suspicion of this, and the explicit nature of the visuals that are being produced in her head about what's happening, and she flies into a panic. She experiences now. Her body isn't at risk, right? Her physical, you could make an argument metaphorically, I suppose, but her world is being completely upended, and you could imagine there being a fear of, well, what else am I not being told? Can I trust anybody? Does this person love me? What else is, who am I? Do I even know how to gauge the world? What's happening? Just whirlwind, right? And for some people, they can have a tremendous amount of terror, a fight or flight, adrenaline terror, the same physiological response that you would have in war, for example. And not probably universal. I mean, it wouldn't be universal, and maybe it's on the rarer side. Like you put 100 people in that situation, maybe like 3 of them will experience the terror that is physiological. And so when this client came to me, and I did a lot of assessment because the PTSD symptoms were there, and I wondered if there were other traumas, and this one just kind of re-triggered it or something. But I did a full, and we could never know, but I did a full assessment, and there wasn't any other trauma prior to that moment. And when I administered my brand of integrative trauma therapy, we focused on the trauma narrative of that incident, and the PTSD symptoms subsided as measured by the TSI-2. So if it wasn't other trauma, in all likelihood, by addressing that trauma narrative, it wouldn't have reduced the symptoms. We would have had to, the symptoms still would have been there. We're like, well, okay, we need to start looking at other trauma narratives that we need to, do imaginal exposure around. Anyway, it's getting into the weeds. But the point is that in 95, in the mid-90s, DSM-4 is out. Well, no, sexual abuse would have been in the DSM by that point. I'm 99% sure of that. But the appreciation of how it can affect someone, but also it's a bit of a problem in my field and in society that when people go through traumas, if we believe Eric and Lyle, all of us would say they were traumatized, right? But not everyone who goes through legitimate trauma and has effects after that trauma, neurologically or personality-wise, not all of those people have PTSD.
Oh, interesting.
So
it's not an automatic. Yeah.
Right. There are. It shouldn't surprise people that the entirety of human experience in reaction to trauma is not encapsulated in the DSM.
Yeah.
It's not its purpose, right? But in fact, I would argue that the majority of effects, like for yourself, you were traumatized, you were raped by your babysitter when you were 5, right? Repeatedly. And you had long-standing effects. You could even say even to today. But if we just looked at the symptoms of the abuse that were present in your adult life 20 years later, 30 years later, they resulted in dysfunction. They resulted in problems in your life. We won't go into detail because we've already talked about it before. And so that's the definition of what one would have the basis to say that you had a disorder as a result of trauma. But it wasn't PTSD, and it's not in the DSM.
Right.
So do we say that it you didn't have a problem?
Right.
You didn't have effects, or they would have been worse if you had PTSD? Not necessarily.
Life is way more gray than that.
Right. So for better or for worse, not every experience is delineated in the DSM. But at the very least, we can absolutely say that the public, judges, a jury of one's peers, would probably see the situation differently. I don't know if it would change legally, but it could change that the motivation, even among the ignorant dudes on the jury, like to say, I have a better appreciation that level of abuse does happen. It can happen to boys, and I'm generally more believing of victims because of being educated by all the different movements that have been afoot in the past 10 years and beyond. And could I say that it could be legitimately downgraded from first-degree murder to manslaughter? Yeah, I could absolutely see that. And I could see how lawyers could and victim advocates could advocate for a revisitation of the trial, because the boys have been in prison now for 35 years. So there's a chance that if you downgrade it to manslaughter, time served, they're released, right?
Yeah, exactly.
35 years.
Right. That's a long time. So I wanted to bring that up because essentially I think in that first trial, the defense was, one of the things they were trying to point out was that you and I, or not you and I, just like an average person, when they think of what they themselves perceive as an imminent danger, may be different if they have had trauma and suffer from PTSD. And because remember, the criteria wasn't, even though I argued for it, the criteria from the judge wasn't even whether it was reasonable. It just needed to be an honest belief. And so they were trying to argue from the legal side, from the defense side, a PTSD victim of this kind of abuse would honestly potentially believe that they were in danger.
Right. And linguistic-wise, I would extend that to a trauma victim.
Right.
PTSD being one of the potential effects.
Yeah, they weren't hanging their hat on PTSD, but that was one of the data points they were trying to throw out there. It's just one of those that probably made no difference, fell on deaf ears altogether.
Yeah, and getting to the legislation or the statutes or the understanding of these laws, I would absolutely support a statute or an understanding of interpreting the law that incorporated this. Yeah. It gets into a weird area, though, because what if you have a case, you have someone who believes they're a victim or makes up that they're a victim, right, and considers it a license, because these kinds of a license to kill, but because the data of these cases are inherently obscured from witnesses typically, so it does open a can of worms.
Yeah, but that's why you have a trial with evidence and you let the juries decide, and it's never going to be perfect. Right. Okay, so I want to wrap up in the patron zone. I wanted to explore what happened then, because you said, is this the end of the story? It's not.
Ooh.
So we're going to find out what's happened since.
Intriguing. All right, well, let's take a break. If you want to hear the final chapter.
The final chapter.
Isn't that band's name Europe?
Yeah, right? Europe, the final countdown.
Can you imagine naming your band like North America?
It's pretty ambitious.
All right, well, if you want to hear this final chapter, the final chapter, then become a patron. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.